Welcome to another edition of the Best Business Minds, where we interview business leaders and academics that write thought-provoking books. I'm Marc Kramer, a serial entrepreneur who consults with family businesses and entrepreneurs. And as you all know, I'm currently teaching entrepreneurship at Vinh University in Hanoi, Vietnam. Today's guest will welcome Dr. Helen Edwards, author of the book, From Marginal to Mainstream, which has great research in it. She put a lot of work into it, and it's a fantastic book, especially for us who are interested in marketing. So Helen, welcome, as Helen is living in London or outside of London?
In London, yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful. So Helen, tell us about your professional background, how you got to where you're at right now.
Well, I started actually in advertising, in the advertising industry, and built a career there, and then decided that in advertising we didn't know enough about business in general. Actually, we were very good at doing what we did, but we didn't know enough about business in general, and I was on the strategic side. So I went to London Business School and did an MBA, and not everyone in Britain who works in business does MBAs. It's unlike America, where almost everyone does it. It's quite an unusual thing to do. And I guess that kind of changed my direction then. So then I did a PhD in marketing. And then since then, I tried to span the sort of the academic and the commercial worlds of marketing, actually, to try to take the best of both. They seem on very different tracks sometimes. So I now teach at London Business School. I'm an adjunct associate professor there. I write for one of the biggest publications here in the UK called Marketing Week. I'm their columnist on branding. And yeah, published this book last year and do consultancy as well. So a bit of everything.
I understand that from being an academic and doing the same things you do as well. And you do it quite well. And you and for the students, it's awesome to have somebody who talks about real world stuff and give them the real exposure to what's really happening. So that's great. Why did you write this book?
It was an interesting one. I'd written a book about 20 years ago and sort of swore I wouldn't write another one because of the amount of effort and time that goes into them. And my publishers wanted me to. And in fact, at the same time, I'd been involved in the early days of COVID with a very well-known in the UK chicken shop. And the project that I was asked to work on with them was how do we deal with the vegan problem? Because they were a chicken shop. And it was and everything was a bit of a panic. It was kind of like, how are we going to do this? You know, it's almost like veganism has sort of crept up on us. And it started to make me think about, well, there must be other behaviors like that people have been doing for a long time. And then they sort of suddenly, but not that suddenly, come into the mainstream. And it made me think that as businesses, as marketers, maybe we could be a bit better at being ahead of them. Understanding these behaviors better, and instead of sort of scrambling to catch up, actually being ahead of the competition, being ahead of the consumer even, and being ready for when these behaviors come into the mainstream. So that kind of set me off thinking, what marginal behaviors are out there? Can we understand them better? Do they all become mainstream or only do some? And how do we read it? So it sort of set up a train of research.
How much has marketing changed in the last 20 years?
I would say it's the fundamentals of marketing haven't changed at all. So if you think about the fundamentals of, what is marketing there to do in the business, it's about really being the bit of the organization that deeply understands the end consumer and deeply understands how we create value for that end consumer. And you use, classic tools of marketing strategy and the levers of marketing to meet those needs. What I would say is how we meet those needs has changed quite a lot. So obviously the digital revolution, particularly in communications, has changed enormously.
So what inspired you to write about marginal behaviors such as transhumanism, free birthing, and polyphasic sleep patterns? I mean, I didn't even know what that was until I read your book.
Yeah, well, it wasn't that I was specifically looking at those marginal behaviors. It was that the first job we had really was to go, are there marginal behaviors out there? So we sort of set ourselves and it was a team, it wasn't just me, I had some researchers on it, a definition, which is a marginal behavior is where less than 1% of the population are doing it, probably, you can't really measure it, but it's a lifestyle choice first. So it's not a consumption choice first. So that's why I think they're different to trends. So I sit in trends presentations every year, and very often they can be about consumption, whereas this is about people going, I want to live my life like this, and there's very few of them right now, and then sort of consumption becomes part of it after then. And we set ourselves a definition, and then I used a researcher to say, go find me some of what's going on out there in the world, and she found, I think, at just under 50 different marginal behaviors.
Yeah, and I was surprised it was that many. How do you define the boundary between marginal behaviors and minority behaviors?
Well, it's not an exact science, but I set it as it's a marginal behavior if it's around 1% of the population doing it. It's a minority behavior if you're around 3% of the population doing it. So in fact, one of the conversations I was having this morning is there are a few marginal behaviors that all unite around one thing, and when they kind of collide, I think you've got a great opportunity for innovation. So if you take the quantified self, so that's daily measuring of sort of biometrics and psychometrics, biohacking, which is using, actually at its pure sense, implants to help or improve performance, and living for longevity, which is a sort of, I will act in a way that extends my life, that I live healthily. I think they're all colliding together. And I think ones like the quantified self probably are now into minority. When I wrote the book, quantified self was definitely a marginal behavior.
What do you think drives people to adopt marginal behaviors despite social norms and potential negative perceptions?
I think it's because, and you need these people, don't you? You need the mavericks, you need the risk takers in life. I think they're people who really believe that this life choice is right for them, right for their family, and very often, and often it was a secondary reason, right for their values around the planet, respect for the planet, respect for humanity, respect for the animal world. So, if you take examples like free birthing, for example, which is giving birth with the minimum of medical intervention, when we spoke to people who had done this, they passionately believed that it was the right thing for them to do, and so they're willing to pay that social price, and often that dollar price as well, to do something that they really believe in.
Can you elaborate on how marketers can predict and facilitate the transition of marginal behaviors into the mainstream? I always thought that was pretty interesting.
Yeah, I mean, this was one of the areas where I kind of set out to try to work out, could we understand these behaviors better so that we could work out as business people, as entrepreneurs, as marketers, which one could be the next veganism and which one definitely will not be the next veganism. And you never get that when you're in a trends presentation. You get just trends, organizations going, here's this trend and that trend, and here's another one. And so we put a considerable amount of effort into primary research, trying to understand behaviors better, and developed what I call beacons in the book. So these are signs, signals, clues, and motifs that shed light on a particular behavior and help you understand, A, its potential to move into the mainstream, and B, what you could do about it to help move it into the mainstream. It's an inconvenient number, right? It's 8. I know that for most business people, like rule of 3 or no more than 5, but it's like 8 different lenses that you would analyze the behavior through to understand its potential better.
What impact do you believe media representation like Lewis, am I saying this right, Thoreau's documentaries has on public perception and acceptance of marginal behaviors?
Well, I think, again, we saw this from our own research, that it's really interesting, actually. It's the explosion of streaming, like media streaming, and particularly our ability to see lots and lots of different content, whether it's on YouTube or Netflix, or what that means in practice is that these content providers have to provide content. And this type of content, which is human interest content, is relatively cheap to make, and people love to watch it. So things like Louis Theroux or New Lives in the Wild is another example. And what that means is that it gets these behaviors, rather than nobody ever knowing about them, they get into mainstream consciousness much faster. Social media is the other way this happens. This is very shareable content, people doing what might be seen as weird stuff. So it's great for streaming and TV. It's very shareable social content too. And what that means in practice is that a much wider group of people get to see it, debate it, consider it, basically. So that's one of the reasons why I think we'll see more marginal behaviours coming into the mainstream than we have, say, in the last previous 20 years.
What's your take on TikTok and Reels? I mean, actually, I hate to say it, but I'm really addicted to Reels. Once I get on there on Facebook, I'm just like, I can't, it's it really is like an addiction. I have to like close my phone and walk away from stopping it. So what's your take on that, and how best to use TikTok and Reels for your business?
Well, I think they're part of the sort of social media and digital communications sort of levers that we have in marketing to pull if we want to, and part of kind of social influence. And I think, they're very effective. They're very effective. They're very difficult to manage, but they're very effective. So I think, they're part of modern marketing, basically.
Do you use those much for yourself? Like now with your book out, do you use it?
I tend not to, because I think you could spend a lot of your life on social media, either on social media or creating content for social media. So I've got to say, I've picked LinkedIn as my social media platform of choice, and I tend to nurture that one and use that one. X or Twitter, I've just kind of walked away from. And Instagram, I tend to use for pleasure rather than for professional purposes. So personally, to make it manageable, I've chosen a platform and decided to nourish that platform. That's where I am. I'm on that platform.
It's very interesting. I'm from the States, but living in Vietnam, and consumer product companies and business to consumer, a lot of them don't have websites. They use Facebook as the platform for them to reach their customers, which in the United States, you see very little companies putting all of their online presence on Facebook. But in Asia, almost all of the business to consumer restaurants, consumer product companies all have big Facebook presence. Why is that so different?
Gosh, I don't know the answer to that. I mean, it could be almost like the life cycle of that platform, because I think there was a time when Facebook, certainly here and in the US, was much more used even by businesses. But I guess if it becomes the norm for businesses to use it in that way, then that's how it grows, actually. I mean, I think what's interesting about these social media platforms right now is, one of the things that I think is interesting about them is how dynamic they will be in the future. I think the dynamism of them, what comes in and what comes out, like, MySpace, Friends Reunited, been and gone. I think we're seeing more of them prevail. Like, I think YouTube, for example, is getting a real second life because of video content is so great now. I think certainly for marketing communications, a lot of great video content that you used to see on broadcast media, you now find on YouTube.
Yeah, and broadcast media is shrinking in terms of number of watchers. And I think also because in YouTube, or especially TikTok and Reels, it's shorter periods, right? And they're most like commercials, and people rather read that and watch it than longer versions. Even I think the media is starting to realize that when they do reports, it's got to be much shorter because people have got so much that they're dealing with that they can't focus on long pieces. Regarding convergence, you mentioned that insidious convergence happens even when marketers strive for differentiation. Can you provide specific examples of how brands in different sectors have successfully broken free from convergence despite regulatory and supply chain pressures?
Yeah, so one of my observations was that we see more innovation being converging around what we would call points of parity in a category. So the category tends to sort of unite around agreed points of parity, and the whole category kind of shifts together. And there are a few reasons for that. It's not just regulatory and supply chain. I think actually the scourge of consumer research as well, that when you know, basically all companies are using the same researchers to do the same research, and consumers are saying the same thing. And so it takes you back to the norm. But the regulatory environment, and I think the supply chain convergence is also driving this. But I think, I mean, I do quite a lot of work in beauty, and I think a really interesting company, again, it's a smallish UK company, but they're growing, called Beauty Pie. Now, the beauty industry is not an industry that you would launch into. It's really competitive. But they launched with a subscription-based model, direct-to-consumer subscription-based model. And their whole idea was convergence of supply chain. So basically, it was based on the fact that, look, you're getting these beauty products from the same suppliers. We're just going to buy it from the supplier, and you will get it at the factory price. So the idea of the name Beauty Pie is you get your share of the pie. You need to be a sort of beauty insider to understand it. So you need to know that you want retinol or you want hyaluronic acid. So you need to know the ingredients. But basically the offer is supply chain convergence is right there. But we're just going to open it up and say, we'll buy from the supplier. You don't have to pay for the brand or the retailer. You get your share of the pie. So I thought that was a very clever response to supply chain convergence.
Yeah, a lot of our students are talking about that and trying to get a real hold on it, especially as Vietnam has been developing and becoming like a centerpiece for Asia, to understand how that's going to work out for them. On consumer centricity, given the inherent risk of relying on consumer-centric approaches, what alternative strategies or even methodologies would you suggest for marketers to anticipate consumer needs and innovate effectively?
Do you know what? I think although I think it's making a return, I think there is such an opportunity to do more ethnography. So ethnography is like observation, either participant or non-participant observation. And it's actually easier to do now than it was sort of even 5 years ago. So it's not been a methodology of choice for many marketing companies. Everyone's always in a rush. So it's like an online survey or a focus group. But the trouble with that is that you ask the same questions, consumers say the same answers. They don't tell you the truth anyway. Observation means that you see consumption in context. You see life, you witness it as it happens. And I think that is so much richer and more robust and more truthful than any of the other methodologies. So I think when you're looking at innovation in particular, it's very useful. And the other reason why I say that I think it's more doable these days is I think digital technology. I mean, I've just done an ethnographic study in Brazil and India, and we supplied people with iPads. And every morning we asked them a question or asked them to fill something on the iPad. And that's how it works. It makes it very doable, actually. So you're not having to send researchers out for like a week to stand around and take photos.
Do you also find that when I found this when I would do interviews with my clients to get good information, that if they didn't have to look me in the eye, it was like a confessional at church, that they were more honest? Do you find because they're using the iPad and somebody's not actually, excuse me, looking at them, that they give more honest answers?
Yeah, definitely. And also you haven't got the classic thing of a focus group is the group effect. And so you don't get it. You've just got somebody, in this case, I was doing it with mothers with young babies, just somebody in a village in India, doing her best with her baby. You get the truth,
Yeah, I don't think focus groups add a lot of value. Like you say, one person can drive the whole group herd mentality with those groups.
Exactly.
Exploring lateral innovation, could you delve deeper into the examples of lateral innovation that have failed to propel significant growth? What distinguishes successful, bold innovations from these lateral attempts?
Well, I think it's sort of lateral innovation is sort of fine. You kind of have to do it because it's part of keeping up with the category. So by lateral innovation, I mean, again, it's like, have we, everyone loves coconut right now. Have we got our coconut variant? There's a new way that we could deliver this moisturizer. Have we done it? Or even online, you were talking about reels. It's like every social media platform now has its short form video. That's lateral
Yeah.
innovation. No one's doing anything different. And you kind of have to do it to keep up. But all that gets you, I think, is incremental share gains. So you're just sort of fighting for share gains. Sort of more breakthrough innovation is when you do something significantly differently, like Beauty Pie, where they just kind of had a completely different business model. Or even again, back in beauty, there's a brand called The Ordinary, where they basically sell the ingredient. You're buying 2% hyaluronic acid or whatever. And that was a kind of a breakthrough, a category that always said, oh, no, don't talk about the ingredient, talk about the benefit. And they went, no, we'll just talk about the ingredients. People know what they want. So that's where you see kind of more breakthrough thinking. But breakthrough thinking is harder to do and it's riskier. And that's why you don't see it so much.
Yeah, but I think that's been going on for quite some time, that people just rather match what's going on because they feel they'd be taking too great a risk if they try to do something radically different.
Yeah, that's right. So you see more of it in the entrepreneurial space, and then you see, bigger companies sort of hoovering up and very often killing the sort of entrepreneurial startup that they bought.
I remember when I was at Wharton and a lot of my colleagues were former chief marketing officers of big companies, and they said, you spend years trying to get to that position and know that the average tenure of a chief marketing officer is about 2 years. You're a lot less likely to take risks because it took so long to get to that, at that time, a $500,000 a year job, or maybe it's $1 million a year job, and you're just looking to play it safe and just match what the competition's doing, as opposed to trying to think of something radically different that would truly differentiate how you sell your product or service.
Yeah, I think also, we get measured in quarters, not years.
Yes.
And I also think that particularly in marketing, the rotation of jobs is quite rapid. And so, no one wants to sort of take a risk and then leave on a down.
Yeah. Technological breakthroughs. You argue that a dearth of high order technological breakthroughs contributes to the status in mainstream marketing. Are there emerging technologies or innovations on the horizon that you believe will disrupt this trend, and how should marketers prepare for them?
Well, I think we're all going to start shouting AI at this point. I think it's interesting because this comes from a theory. There's a great book called The Great Stagnation, I think it is, by Tyler Cowen, who's a professor. And he talks about how there are these massive changes in technology, but he's talking about things like refrigeration and the combustion engine and then digital technology. And they set off years and years and years of like innovation. And his argument is that the latest one, which is the technological innovation, the low-hanging fruit, if you like, of innovation has already been taken. So we're done. It's sort of the easy stuff has gone. And therefore that leads to a kind of stasis. There are other people like Bill Gates, for example, who thinks there's much more to be gained from the technological revolution, but we're going to have to be a bit more imaginative about what we do. And I think for me, AI kind of fits into that bucket, if you like, of like, okay, it's there, it's part of the technological revolution. How can, what is its potential? How can we be imaginative about what we do with it? And the kind of jury's out on that. For me, it's a watching brief, very much a watching brief in AI.
I think AI is an efficiency tool, and all of our students are using AI. The big problem that we have with AI with students is saying to them, you have to show your original thinking. You can't go feed the question to AI and then copy and paste it in, because otherwise you're adding no value. I mean, I just spoke to a group of 120 incoming freshmen to our school. And I said, the reason you can use AI to get statistics, but you still have to go and do research to make sure that those are even accurate. But if you can't write original content based on what you're learning in class, how are you going to do that in the real world when you go to work for some large corporation? Your boss asks you something, and if you're just cutting and pasting what the boss asked you into AI, he could do that himself, or she can.
Yeah.
So they don't need you. So I think
Yeah.
AI is, it's not a fad, it's permanent. We're going to be using it the rest of our lives. It's a question about how do you really use it in an effective manner and not put yourself out of a job where the boss realizes they don't need you because this thing can do other things, but it can free you up, and it makes it faster, better. I mean, I have to say the AI tools that I use, I create PowerPoint presentations for class. It's my content, but now I'm able to cut and paste it into something like Gamma and come out with beautiful slides as opposed to the ugly things that I was
Yeah.
putting together. So I think there's going to be enormous value there. Learning from Steve Jobs, you highlighted Steve Jobs' approach of using internal employees for consumer insights as ahead of its time. Can contemporary marketers effectively identify and leverage similar ahead groups within their organizations or customer base to drive innovation?
Yeah, I mean, I think we don't do enough with our frontline staff, actually, where there are frontline staff. And in most businesses, there are, you know, obvious ones like the service industry and sort of hospitality and retail, in travel. You know, the other person who did that was, in fact, Tim Davis, who's the CEO of Emirates Airline. He asked his flight crews to observe what people were doing, and in many ways, it was that observation that led him to be able to basically, you know, forge ahead what was offered in coach and standard class on those flights and really make a name for Emirates. So I think there's lots of opportunities for our frontline staff to almost do that kind of ethnographic work for us, actually. And then I've always thought that when you are working in a category that's very traditional, you know, if you take something like pain relief, very traditional, there's basically acetaminophen and ibuprofen. Is, you know, how do you break through with original thinking in there? Well, you know, maybe go and talk to the people who embrace pain, people who, you know, extreme marathon runners or whatever. Go and talk to people who embrace pain at the, if you like, at the margins of your category, to see if you can get any kind of breakthrough thinking by doing so.
What specific criteria do you use to identify promising marginal behaviors that could potentially achieve mainstream growth?
Well, I talked about these 8 beacons earlier, and I think there are probably 2 that are absolutely key. Well, one that's absolutely key, and which we found very early on. And the 2 that are key are the 2. One is intensity, and the other is resistance. So intensity means that the people who are doing it right now, the less than 1% who are going, I really want to do this, you need them to be really committed, really willing to pay the social and often financial price to partake in this behavior. And the reason you need them is that without them, the behavior will just sort of fritter away and die. So if you're looking for behaviors that might become mainstream, the first thing to go is, are there a group of people that really believe in this, that really intensely believe in it? Because if there aren't, if it's just a bit of a vague, I've tried it, that doesn't work. The other thing is mainstream resistance. Now, the reason these marginal behaviors aren't mainstream right now is because the mainstream are resisting them for some reason. Now, what we found is that rather than just go, oh, there's resistance, what you need to do is understand the nature of the resistance. So are they resisting because they think it might threaten their lives, in the example of, say, microdosing or even free birthing for some people, through various shades of sort of social discomfort? Are they resisting because they think it's disgusting or a bit weird? Or are they resisting because they're kind of curious about it, but practically it's quite a difficult thing to do, like polyphasic sleeping? Now, the more towards the curious but practically difficult the resistance is, the greater potential there is for business to step in and say, well, we can make this easier for you. And so that is a way of going, okay, you know, the resistance is kind of curious but impractical. We could make doing a bit of this a bit easier. We can make this a bit easier for people, to bring more people in it who clearly are interested. And so that was key, actually. Key to predicting whether something's going to become more mainstream is the nature of the intensity and the resistance.
How do you evaluate the risk and rewards of investing in marginal behavior or niche market as opposed to a more established one, which goes back to the risk I was telling you that some of my colleagues were afraid to take because it could cost them their job. But really, that's why entrepreneurs exist, is because they do that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess for mainstream companies, and I've talked to a lot of big traditional companies about this, my message to them has always been, look, you have an innovation stream of work that happens every year, right? And there are lots of different ways that we look at innovation. We look at process innovation, we look at innovating from the core, adjacent space innovation, all of that kind of stuff. And often we use our own R&D to give us a technology. So like supply side innovation, you said we got a new technology that we could innovate against. All I'm saying is have the consideration of marginal behaviors as an added work stream to your existing innovation pipeline and practice, because I think it's just been very neglected recently. Have it as an additional work stream and experiment against these behaviors, and maybe even just get as far as being ready. So if this particular chicken shop that I started this session talking about had maybe thought about veganism before now, and maybe not launched a vegan burger or a vegan whatever meal, but been ready to move quickly once they decided to, they would have been in a better position than they were when we started.
I think a lot of companies that have gone under have not thought of it that way and haven't taken advantage of it.
Yeah.
Can you provide more examples of marginal behaviors that successfully transition to the mainstream, similar to Oatly and mindfulness?
Yeah, no, this is an interesting one, because I think what's great about marginal behaviors when they come into the mainstream. So in the book, one of the examples I give, which always blows people's mind, is exercise for its own sake, going to the gym, going for a jog. Now, in the late 60s, somebody went for a jog and was arrested for it. It's because it was a marginal behavior. They were arrested for misuse of the public highway in Portland. Was it Portland, Oregon? It was anyway, they were arrested for misuse of the public highway. Hartford, Connecticut was where it was. And since then, we've had the exercise revolution. And so that marginal behavior of exercising for its own sake, and the reason we didn't do that was because our jobs were much more physical, and heart disease was less of an issue because our jobs were much more physical, and also we didn't have all the labor-saving devices at home that we have now. So heart disease becomes an issue, and now we all have to exercise just to exercise. And that began the exercise revolution. Now, what's amazing about a marginal behavior when it takes off, and I think we've seen the same thing with veganism and even mindfulness or meditation, is it doesn't just fuel one category like gyms. It fuels multiple categories. If you think about the exercise revolution, multiple categories have benefited. Clothing, Nike, one of the most successful brands in the world, clothing, gyms, tech-enabled fitness, food and drink, travel, multiple categories benefit, and they continue to benefit. The exercise revolution continues. If you take something like meditation or mindfulness, which is much newer, it isn't just like the meditation world that's sort of taken off with, apps like Calm, for example, but actually things like food and drink in sort of calming teas and that kind of thing, spaces, how we organize our spaces, what we do at work, again, leisure time. It's multiple categories that sort of get fed by it. So we're not going to see loads of them take off, actually. And I think those are two key ones. Another two that I'd mention are esports, which we looked at as an established marginal behavior, much more mainstream. We used it as a control in our first research, but I think esports is a marginal behavior that is now mainstream. And the other one, which I think is really interesting, actually, which someone else talked to me about, and if I was writing the book again, I'd look at it, is distance learning. So digital learning has just taken off like a train recently, and COVID gave it a shove as well. But it's not like distance learning didn't exist before. It's people did do distance learning degrees, and they were posted their notes, and they sort of, but in fact, digital technology and COVID really shoved sort of individual distance learning. And I think that is a marginal behavior that's become mainstream.
I have to say though, one thing they found about distance learning is, I used to be a statewide trustee in Pennsylvania for all the state university system, and they really felt back in the 90s that distance learning would eventually change the course of university learning, that nobody would go to college, that everybody would do it from home, that there'd be no need for campuses. And I thought it was
Yeah,
crazy. I mean, I guess
yeah,
I was in my late 30s, early 40s. I said, how would they party? Just that
yeah,
simple. How would they party?
yeah,
And they basically found now that distance learning is wonderful when you can't be close to the campus. But if you can at all get to the campus, that's where all the interaction happens with your classmates, but also with your faculty and students. That distance learning, you don't have much interaction with the faculty when you do it, because you just can't stop after the class and just hang out or have a coffee with them.
yeah. But also I think distance learning is amazing for lifelong learning, which then
Yeah.
collides maybe with another marginal behavior, or now minority behavior, which is about living for longevity. And it sort of collides with one of the behaviors that we saw in the most recent research that I've done, which we haven't published yet, was a behavior that, well, it was homeschooling. Now, I don't
Yeah.
think that we've got droves of parents wanting to homeschool their children, but I think what we've got is parents going, I'm looking for other learning opportunities that I can surround traditional schooling with, because I see that my child needs it. So really interesting, I think, the whole educational environment.
I'm wondering how much homeschooling either increased or dropped after the pandemic was over, because you know, you were reading parents getting super stressed out having to be the teacher for their kids, or having to stay on top of their kids to make sure that they were going online to learn their lessons. And teachers were saying it was highly stressful for them, and felt they weren't making the same connection that they did in the classroom. Do you know any statistics about, has this increased or decreased homeschooling?
Well, what we saw in our most recent research, which is not published, I've only just seen the results come in, is that interest in homeschooling has really taken off. Now, as I said, I don't think that interest in, I want to stay at home and take my kids out of school and educate them. But I think what it means is, and I think maybe the pandemic was responsible for this, a realization of there's so much more to learning than what you learn at school, and there's so much more that you can do without them having to be in school, and maybe I should support the school learning with specific stuff I do at home.
What role do cultural and societal factors play in the diffusion of marginal behaviors into mainstream acceptance?
Well, obviously it's kind of huge. I think there's one cultural factor that surprised us when we did the research, which we call vectors, which very often a marginal behavior, and this was true for veganism, is part of a group of behaviors in a subculture. So veganism was actually part of being a punk. And what that means in practice is that if you've got a teenager in the house who's a punk in the 90s or whatever, they would have come home to their mainstream home and say, I need to be plant-based, I need to be vegan now. It sort of carries a marginal behavior into the mainstream via a subculture. And that was really interesting, actually. So I think those kind of cultural and societal factors make a huge difference. And the other thing we saw from our own research, and I don't really like this sort of, I don't usually subscribe to this sort of, there's baby boomers and Gen X and Gen Y and Gen Z. We did do research with Gen Z, and they're an interesting cohort because, you know, they're the biggest cohort at the moment in the adult population. And they are very, very non-tribal, very open-minded. And I think we could see them culturally being part of bringing more behaviors into the mainstream.
We have a question from the audience. What behavior would you consider to be the next big thing in the next 5 years under normal circumstances and conditions, without any assistance from another global disaster like the pandemic? And what would be your reasons?
I think I think living for longevity is probably already a minority behavior. And I think we're just going to see that grow and grow and grow. And things like quantified self and biohacking are all going to like feed into it. So I think that's an area that we're going to see take off. The other one that I believe will grow is what we call living off the sea. So this is an interesting one. This is using kelp, which grows at a phenomenal rate naturally under the sea, as a resource. And you can use it as a resource for, you know, food and drink, for beauty and health products, but you can also use it as a resource to make packaging that's compostable. There's a wonderful packaging company called Nopla who use it, and I've also recently seen it used as a raw material in furniture and sort of clothing. So what's interesting about living off the sea is when you ask people about it, the resistance is really low. There's no reason to resist. It's not disgusting. And in fact, people are very pro it, because what they say is, well, look, if we are using our oceans as a natural resource, maybe we'll respect them a bit more. Maybe we'll stop using them as a great big dustbin and we'll respect our oceans. So for many regular people, this is a kind of a win-win. And of course, so it's respect for our oceans. It's this amazing natural resource. It has none of the yuck factor of sort of insect protein. And it's got multi-category sort of relevance. So that's one that I think has got a lot of potential.
Do you eat that a lot yourself?
I certainly do eat kelp and seaweed products. And actually there's a kelp farm. Kelp, you'll see now, kelp farms are getting licensed around the various oceans. It's got amazing potential, I think.
It's very interesting. I hadn't thought about eating that, but I hear people getting more and more into it like you have. Question about quantitative survey design. How were the 21 major marginal behaviors and the 2 mainstream behaviors selected for the quantitative surveys in the UK and US? And what criteria were used to define and categorize them as marginal or mainstream?
Well, I mean, I've got to say, when we did this research, it was pretty experimental. I've just done it again with Kantar, who are a global research company. So the first time I did it in 2022 was with a relatively small quantitative research company, professional, but relatively small. And we did them in the UK and the US. Kantar is like the big name. And we've just done some substantial new quant research in the US, the UK, and actually Brazil. And we're analysing that data. How do we pick the 20? We pick the 20 really from guesswork of which do we think it would be interesting to understand more about. And then secondly, the 2 controls, which were veganism and esports, they were taken as, look, we're pretty certain that they are minority behaviours. So they sit around that 3 to 10% of the population know about them. Whereas the marginal behaviours, we wanted to be pretty confident that less than 1% of the population were partaking in it regularly. And we were pretty confident of that. But you know, I'm not going to lie, the 20 were like, okay, let's try these 20. We did do some qualitative research first. So we did do focus groups actually in the UK and the US. We did about 15 in total. And what we did was we did some pre-research to look at some of those behaviours with mainstream audiences. So we had a little bit of an understanding of what might happen in quant, but it was experimental.
Question about focus group insights, and I'm not crazy about focus groups at all. I just find that, you know, as we talked about earlier, one person can drive everybody's thinking. What are the most surprising or unexpected findings from focus groups regarding the 8 marginal behaviors that were probed more deeply? And how did participants' attitudes evolve as they were exposed to more information about these behaviors?
Well, you know, I agree with you about focus groups. I mean, I think like most things, you know, research, when it's done well, is good research. But there's a lot of bad research. So, you know, I used a professional researcher who I trust to help me design the focus groups, and then she conducted and then she analysed the focus groups. So they were very carefully put together. And again, we sort of learned as we went along. So what we did is we gradually exposed more information about the behaviours. to see where, so if you took something like insect protein, which is very interesting to us, we would just start by saying, what does anyone know about insect protein? You almost immediately hit the resistance with insect protein. It's yuck, it's disgusting, it's dirty, it's horrible. And then what we did is we exposed more and more information about that behavior. So we'd say, well, are you aware that it's a very healthy form of low-fat form of protein and it's good for the planet? Are you aware that it's been part of the food chain for for millions of years? Are you aware that in other countries it's the norm? And then we would show some of the entrepreneurial businesses. And what we wanted to see was, through that sort of gradual reveal, if you like, whether mainstream attitudes started to shift and what was the trigger for the shift. So that's how we managed the focus groups.
On the concept of intensity and resistance, how did you arrive at the categorization of intensity and resistance as the elemental beacons of marginal behaviors? And what were some of the other potential categories or descriptors you considered?
For us, they were the elemental ones, because we realized that, for a marginal behavior to have any chance at all of going into the mainstream, people need to know about it. You need to have some awareness of it. Secondly, the people who do it need to really believe in it. Otherwise, as I said earlier, it's just going to sort of fritter away and dribble away and die. And then knowing what type of resistance you've got was such a breakthrough for us, that as soon as we knew that there is that some resistance actually isn't resistance, it's curiosity, and it's like, I'd love to do this, but it's impractical, then that was absolutely key. So that's why they were very much the elemental ones. Now, obviously, we could have gone, oh no, it's all about accelerators, which is used a lot in innovation. It's like, is there a coming change in legislation or social and cultural norms, or the wider environment that would give this behavior a bit of a shove? Now, that was part of our 8 lenses, but we didn't see it as important as intensity and resistance. The other thing that we thought was really important, and again, but not as important, was the ability of business or entrepreneurs to either reframe or dilute a behavior to make it more acceptable to mainstream audiences. So if you're at the curiosity end of the resistance, you are looking for ways to do this. And then it's down to the business or an entrepreneur. Can they reframe it to make it feel more acceptable? It's not insect protein, it's the original protein. Can you dilute it to make it easier for people? So I'm not going to give you a cricket that looks like a cricket. I'm going to put cricket flour in a stock cube. So that's where those are actions that we as business people can take to help a behavior into the mainstream.
Yeah, I was in Cambodia last year and I saw them selling bags of crickets to eat. I just couldn't bring myself to be that adventurous. Just going to Cambodia was enough to be adventurous. Research and examples. Can you elaborate on methodology of the original research mentioned in the chapter, particularly how you selected and analyzed specific marginal behaviors like veganism and naturism?
Yeah, so this was another sort of plank of the research. So the book has original quantitative research, original qualitative research, which is the focus groups. We also did some kind of ethnography of our own. So we went out and we interviewed people who were taking, and there's a little panel at the end of every chapter, which is like the interview with somebody who's a microdoser, or the interview with somebody who is a free birther. So we interviewed people who took part in these behaviors. And then what we also did is I had a researcher purely dedicated to desk research, looking at behaviors that either were marginal and are now mainstream, like exercise for its own sake and veganism. We wanted to really look in detail at their journey from marginal to mainstream to help us understand, what the common factors are. And we looked at that for exercise for its own sake, veganism, and meditation or mindfulness. And then we also wanted to look at behaviors that could have gone mainstream but didn't. So a brilliant example of that is homeopathy. And that's been around for hundreds of years, but it's never become mainstream. And so we wanted to understand, it helped us understand what factors drive something more to be mainstream and which don't. We also looked at, as you say, naturism, And we looked at tattoos as well. So there were a few that we looked at, and we considered looking at, in Japan, there's that whole thing of kind of cute culture. We considered looking at that as well, but we felt we didn't have enough specific insight to do that one.
Can you elaborate on how marketers and entrepreneurs can identify when a marginal behavior is on the brink of reversal?
Yeah, so reversal is an interesting one. And I think we saw that in veganism, and actually exercise for its own sake. And this won't happen very often. It's when the reason to do it becomes, the reason not to do it almost becomes the reason to do it. So in veganism, people weren't, the reason that vegans were vegans in the very early days is because of animal welfare. And the reason that the mainstream weren't vegans was because they thought that they needed meat in order to stay healthy. So meat was needed in the diet to stay healthy. And then suddenly understanding flipped into reverse. Actually, meat, a diet high in meat and low in plant food is seen as actually unhealthy. And so there was a flip in understanding, and that is what reversal is. And then what happens when that happens is it kind of takes off like a train. I don't think we'll see that happening that often, but it's definitely one to look out for.
In the context of reversal, are there any specific indicators or metrics that suggest resistance has not only subsided, but flipped to support the behavior?
Yeah, you would see it almost immediately. So I think within veganism, and what happens is you see the reversal happening in the broader kind of cultural capital, if you like, often through academic research, and then you see it picked up in the media, and then you see people acting on it, but it happens really quickly. And that's why you would want to keep monitoring these. And that's why when I said, look, it doesn't mean to say that you have to be so brave that you're a mainstream food brand and you're going to launch an insect protein packet of crisps, but be ready to do it if something happens that sends it taking off like a train.
What strategies can be used to maintain the momentum of behavior efforts entered into the dilution phase to ensure long-term growth and acceptance? I think this is what happens to large companies when they become so reliant on their main products and don't put more money into R&D.
Yeah, I think I was talking about this yesterday, actually. I think a lot of it is innovate, learn, innovate, experiment. Don't launch and run away. Because I think very often what happens is, we innovate, we launch, we run away. And I think particularly if you're innovating against a marginal behavior, it's like keep it small, experiment, learn, experiment, launch, learn, continue to innovate against that growing interest. And so it's a sustained effort rather than a sort of, okay, well, we've done it now and it didn't work. I've heard that before, well, we tried insect protein, it didn't work. It's like, well, that you've got to experiment, learn, experiment again, because it's not going anywhere.
How can companies or individuals balance the purity of the original behavior with the adoptions and interpretations that come with dilution to appeal to a broader audience?
Yeah, this is interesting, because I think that the intense advocates are often quite protective of their behavior in its purest form. Like people would call people who are sort of part-time vegans like a dirty vegan, because they're not properly plant-based. And so what needs to happen there is respect, actually. So companies need to respect the purity of the behavior while diluting it for more mainstream people to enjoy and derive value from. Because in the end, the people who are in this behavior for its pure form, it's not that they don't want other people to do it, it's that they believe in its pure form and they want that respected. So there's a brilliant example. So Wicca, which is modern day witchcraft, is very popular with younger people, especially younger women. Witch talk is huge. And Sephora, the beauty company, they launched like a witch spell kit in Sephora. It was terrible. I mean, it was just awful. But partly the reason it was awful is because all of those witch talk devotees were just saying this is almost like, a joke. It's not, they're not taking it seriously. And so that's what you've got to be really careful with. It was withdrawn. And I think very often with things like Wicker, is it's not about Sephora going, let's launch a spell kit. It's about Sephora saying, what is the enthusiasm for Wicker telling us about modern young women? What's it telling us about, you know, female empowerment, spirituality, storytelling that we could react to?
Is Wicker big in the UK? I never really heard it mentioned in the US, but maybe because I'm 63, I'm not hearing about this.
I think being a man in 63 isn't helping you. I think it's a marginal behavior. So I'm not surprised you haven't heard of it. Witch talk is massive. But I think we're seeing it come through in diluted forms. Like, you might be aware that a lot of people are quite into crystals at the moment and using
Yes.
crystals as part of their home decor. Now, that would be a dilution of Wicca.
Interesting. I mean, I had a student at another university, and she was developing shirts and blouses all based on using crystal throughout it as a way to protect you. And I thought, "God, that's bizarre," but I didn't really think more about it now until you've just mentioned it. And I often hear students. I was in Indonesia, and I was taken to a puppet. A family has been creating puppets for 150 years, and some of them wouldn't buy these beautiful puppets because they said they had religious symbolism in it. And I had no idea what they were talking. I couldn't even see it. But maybe that's all deals with what you're just talking about now.
Yeah, related, I would have said,
Yeah. Could you provide more examples of behaviors or trends other than exercise and veganism that have experienced the M2M pathway and reached mainstream acceptance?
Well, I think, as I said earlier, that there aren't going to be lots of them because, you know, they're not a trend. It's not like purple is big this year and purple isn't big next year. Once a marginal behavior becomes mainstream, the potential to kind of keep going is very big. And I think veganism and exercise for its own sake is still on a journey, as is mindfulness. I think tattoos would be another example. I think esports, we've already talked about. I think distance learning and digital learning is in the foothills still. I think there's a lot of potential there. Living for longevity, where we've got marginal behaviors colliding within one bigger behavior. So quantified self, biohacking, living for longevity. I think homeschooling and distance learning are kind of coming together. So I think you're looking at individual behaviors and then you're looking for where they collide for potential as well.
I'm amazed about tattoos because when I was younger, almost like nobody had tattoos except for military and I guess bikers and people who are like work on the docks. But now, if you don't have a tattoo, you're in the as far as I can see, you're in the minority.
Yeah. I mean, not in Japan. It's still frowned upon in Japan for reasons of the gangs. It was part of that
Yakuza
gang culture. Yakuza gang, but in the Western world, definitely. But you're right. It was a marginal behavior for decades and decades. It was prisoners and it was, sailors who had tattoos. And really what brought that into the mainstream was partly the cultural capital that those people carry with them, but also the sophistication of the art of tattoos as well. So if you like, a technological acceleration as well. And people looking to individualize themselves more.
No question about it. I mean, I know people much older than me who got tattoos just recently. I mean, they're, in their 70s and 80s getting tattoos. It's crazy.
Gotta go for it, Mark.
Interesting. Yeah, I know. Can you explain in more detail how you determine the weightings for each of the factors in the composite score methodology?
Yeah, again, we've just adjusted it in the new research. So we're testing and learning as we went along. The way we did it the first time was using the qualitative research as the recognition that awareness and resistance were key. And so they got more of a weighting and understanding, and then the type of resistance. Am I resisting because I'm disgusted by it, or am I resisting because it's impractical? So that weighting happened there. So we looked at a few factors. We used our qualitative research to help us, And then we took a subsample of the sample where we defined people as risk takers, because risk takers are the people that will carry something more into, like, attitudinally risk takers into the mainstream. And we looked to see if there were more risk takers that were open to it and used that as well. So it was playing around with spreadsheets quite a lot to get to something that we sort of felt right. Then in the most recent quant research, we've tried it again and it worked, but we've slightly adjusted it.
Here's my last question for you, and I so appreciate you taking the time to talk about your book. And you did so much great work in this book. It's one of those books you got to read a couple times to even understand it. Could you provide an example of a behavior that scored high on practicality and low on negative emotions, and explain why it's likely to go mainstream?
Well, I've talked about one, which is living from the sea. So, you know, it's becoming more practical for people and people are really open to it. They would really like to do it. I think the other one would be quantified self, is that, you know, even when we were doing that research, so that's measuring biometrics and psychometrics, you know, the reason people, again, very open to that because health systems are increasingly under pressure and people know they're going to have to look after their own health. And people are making, and then technology is making it very doable. You know, we can track our health on our phones, on our watches. You've got armbands like Whoop, you've got apps in the UK like Zoe, and then for psychometrics, you've got things like Calm. So that, again, scored very highly. There was an interesting one, just to leave you on a thoughtful one, which was microdosing. So that's taking very small amounts of magic mushroom. It's illegal, right? Okay, so it's illegal. It's not illegal everywhere in the States, but it's illegal in most places. I think that's one to watch for a couple of reasons. One is that people are very open to it. Young people especially, they don't like the idea of alcohol and binge drinking. They like the idea of small lifts from a natural source. And I think we're seeing increasing research of the health benefits of microdosing, and I think we might see legislation change.
I have to say, as I said before, it was a quick hour. I so enjoyed it. I thank you for taking the time to speak with us. And hopefully you won't wait another 20 years to do the next book.
Oh, well, thank you. That's good encouragement. But no, it's been really interesting to talk about it. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you so much. Well, have a great rest of your day and a great weekend. And everyone, we'll look forward to seeing you next Friday. Bye, everybody.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Bye-bye.